The sound of the water hitting the branches was the sound of something patient. Not the frantic rushing of the flood that had taken his boat. Not the chaos of the first minutes when the aluminum hull had crumpled against a submerged root and the current had taken him and the current had not cared what it took. This sound was slower, deliberate. The sound of water that had settled into a new configuration and intended to stay there, moving around the base of the dead tree with a rhythm that his exhausted mind kept trying to interpret as language. And below that sound, occasionally, the sound of something much heavier than water displacing itself. A shape moving just below the surface, and then the click of a jaw. His eyes weighed more than eyes should weigh. This is the human limit. I am your host. If you want to understand what the human mind does when it cannot sleep, and cannot escape, and cannot afford to make a single mistake for 9 consecutive days, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the like button, because what I am going to describe is not just a story about survival in the Australian wilderness. It is a story about what happens when the most fundamental biological need of the human brain becomes the thing that will kill you. Sleep deprivation is a form of torture. It has been used as one, and this man experienced it at the hands of a flood and a tree and creatures that are older than almost anything else alive on this planet. His name in the account he later provided is Marcus. He was a nature guide, which means he knew the saltwater crocodiles of the Australian North not as abstract facts in a field guide, but as animals he had spent years learning to read and respect and navigate around. He knew their patience. He knew their intelligence. He knew the specific quality of stillness they achieve when they are waiting rather than hunting. The way they become part of the water itself, visible only as a slight texture change in the surface, an eye ridge, a nostril, a presence that the evolved nervous system recognizes before the conscious mind can identify why. He knew what was in the water below him. The flood had come on the second day of a solo survey route through a remote mangrove system in the Northern Territory, a region he had worked for years, a route he had done before without incident. The wet season had produced unusual rainfall that week, the kind of accumulation that the landscape can absorb and then cannot, and the runoff came as a wall rather than a rise, a movement of water that the channels could not contain, and that spread across the flatland with a speed and force that gave him approximately 40 seconds between the sound of it coming and the moment it hit his boat. 40 seconds was not enough. He got to the tree. That is the essential fact of the first minutes. Everything else was the flood and the noise and the shock and the specific helplessness of a human body in a current that has made up its mind. But the outcome of the first minutes was that he got to the tree, a dead mangrove rising from the newly formed water with its lower branches at approximately chest height, and he climbed it, and the water rose to just below his feet, and he held on. The first crocodile arrived within the hour. He had been in the water. He understood immediately what that meant. He had been bleeding from a gash on his forearm where the boat's hull had caught him during the capsize, and saltwater crocodiles are not sharks, are not primarily chemical hunters, but blood in warm, shallow water in crocodile habitat has a meaning that does not require any particular species to interpret. It arrived without announcement, a displacement in the water around the tree's roots, and then a length of scale and muscle that he estimated at over 4 meters came to rest in the space between 2 roots and became still. It was not threatening him. Not yet. It was occupying the space. It was waiting to see what the space contained and what the space would do. More arrived over the following hours. By nightfall of the first day he could count at least 4, though in the dark he could only count by the eyes, the specific orange-yellow reflection of whatever ambient light reached the water's surface. 4 pairs of eyes in the water below him. 4 points of patience. 4 calculations he could not access about when and whether to act. He could not sleep. Here is what that means biologically, because the biology is the story. The human brain requires sleep the way the human body requires water. It is not optional in any functional sense. During sleep, the brain performs maintenance operations that cannot be performed during wakefulness, clearing metabolic waste, consolidating memory, regulating the hormonal systems that govern stress response and immune function and cognitive processing. Deprive a brain of sleep and these operations do not simply pause, they begin to fail. After 24 hours without sleep, cognitive impairment is measurable and significant. After 48 hours, hallucinations begin in most people. After 72 hours, the brain begins to produce psychotic episodes in individuals who have no psychiatric history. After 96 hours and beyond, the brain enters a state that researchers describe as a breakdown of the distinction between waking and dreaming, a state in which the content of sleep forces itself into waking consciousness because the brain cannot be denied what it needs. He was going to be in this tree for 9 days. He understood on the first night, when the exhaustion of the flood and the climb and the terror hit him with their full weight, and his eyes began to close, and his grip began to loosen, and his body began to do the thing that bodies do when they are pushed past their limit. He understood that sleeping meant falling, and falling meant the water, and the water contained things that would end him before he hit the bottom. He tore his shirt into strips on the second day. Not to make a signal, not to make a bandage, to tie himself to the tree. He wrapped the fabric around his wrists and around the branch above him, and pulled it tight enough that even if his hands released, he would not immediately fall, that the fabric would catch him, give him the fraction of a second to wake up that might be enough. It was not a solution. It was a delay mechanism, a way of giving himself a margin he did not naturally have. He began to talk to himself on the third day, not in the way that people talk to themselves when they are working through a problem or narrating an action, in the way that people talk to themselves when the part of the brain that produces language is searching for an audience and has to create one. He talked about things he remembered, procedures, routes, the names of animals, the habits of species he had studied. He talked to keep the brain occupied. He talked because talking required staying awake, and staying awake required something to do, and talking was something to do. On the fourth day, he heard a voice that was not his. He was not asleep. That is the specific and disturbing fact he emphasizes in his account. He was awake, tied to the branch, looking at the water below him, and a voice said something to him from the direction of the water. Not a sound that could have been a crocodile, a voice. A human voice using words. He cannot reconstruct what the words were. He knows they were words, and he knows they came from the water, and he knows they were not there. And he knows that knowing they were not there did not make them not there. If you have ever stayed up long enough to feel your brain begin to generate its own reality, you know the specific helplessness of that experience. If you are feeling a version of it now, leave a like on this video and subscribe to The Human Limit. We are not done with what sleep deprivation does to the human mind, and the worst of it comes next. The microsleep episodes began on the 5th day. A microsleep is not a choice. It is not a moment of weakness or a lapse of discipline. It is the brain forcing approximately 5 to 15 seconds of sleep, regardless of what the body is doing, because the brain has reached the point where the deficit cannot be maintained any longer, and it simply takes what it needs. People experience microsleeps while driving, while operating machinery, while performing tasks that require continuous attention. The difference between a microsleep in those contexts and a microsleep in a dead tree above 4 saltwater crocodiles is the difference between a dangerous situation and an immediately lethal one. He woke from the first microsleep because the fabric caught him. His hands had released. His body had slumped forward. The strips of his shirt around his wrists had pulled taut, and the sensation of falling had activated the startle reflex that woke him before he fell, and he was back, gripping the branch, looking at the water, his heart at a rate that he describes as the heart of someone who has just died and come back. He tore more fabric from what was left of his shirt, retied the knots, tighter this time, testing the tension before he trusted it. The crocodiles had not moved. By the 6th day, the content of his hallucinations had changed. The voices from the water had become more frequent and more specific. They were giving him instructions. He reports this without dramatization, which I find the most disturbing quality of the account. He is not describing a movie. He is describing his own mind telling him, in clear language, to get into the water. Not threatening language, reasonable language. The language of an argument that his exhausted brain was constructing, with the specific efficiency of a mind that no longer has the resources to maintain the distinction between the arguments it generates and the reality it perceives. He knew the arguments were not real. He could identify them as hallucinations in the same moment he was hearing them, and he could not make them stop. He began using pain as a tool on the 6th day. Not severe self-harm, controlled discomfort. The specific stimulus of pinching, pressing a thumbnail into his palm, forcing his body to generate pain signals that required the brain to process them and stay awake to process them. Pain as a maintenance protocol. Pain as the alternative to the voices in the water. He caught rain on the 7th day in a fold of the remaining fabric. A small amount, enough to wet his mouth, to address the dehydration that had been accumulating along with everything else. He ate what insects came to the tree. He did not think about eating them the way a person thinks about eating insects in normal circumstances. He thought about calories and protein the way a machine thinks about fuel. His relationship to ordinary categories of acceptable and unacceptable had dissolved somewhere around day 4. The animals below him had established a routine. This is the thing he describes that I find most remarkable. The crocodiles had not simply waited randomly. They had established a rotation, with at least one individual always proximate to the base of the tree and others resting further out. They were managing the watch. He understood this intellectually, and he understood it at a level that went below intellect, that registered in the nervous system as the specific cold feeling of being studied by something that is smarter than your fear of it. He had named them by the 8th day. He reports this as an embarrassing detail, but I do not think it is embarrassing. I think it is the mind finding a way to survive the unbearable by converting predators into characters, by making the thing that wants to kill him into something with a name and a personality and a manageable relationship rather than an abstract death sentence. It is irrational. It is also what the mind does. It is what the mind has been doing since before there was language to put it in. On the morning of the 9th day, he was not able to form a complete sentence. The account he later gave of this period is fragmentary in a way that his account of the earlier days is not. He remembers colors. He remembers sounds that did not correspond to anything present. He remembers the specific texture of the bark under his palms with a clarity that everything else from that period lacks. He remembers understanding that something had changed, but not being able to identify what it was. The helicopter sound began as a hallucination. That is the specific cruelty of the 9th day. He had been hearing sounds that were not there for 5 days. The sound of a helicopter was not obviously different from the other sounds his brain had been generating. He did not immediately orient to it. He did not immediately understand that it was different. He describes a process of elimination, a slow and damaged assessment of whether this sound was the kind his brain made or the kind the world made, and the assessment took time that he could not afford, and that he was taking anyway because he did not have the capacity to act on information before he had verified it. The sound did not stop when he expected it to. Hallucinated sounds have a quality. They arrive and they are vivid, and then they are gone, replaced by other sounds or by silence. This sound continued. It changed in pitch, the way a real mechanical sound changes when its source moves through space. It had a directionality that his hallucinations had not had. It was getting louder. He moved. Whatever coordination remained in his body after 9 days, he used it. He untied the fabric from his wrists. He stood on the branch. He waved what was left of his shirt, which was not much, which was the strips he had been retying for 9 days, which were unrecognizable as a shirt, but visible as movement, and that was enough. The helicopter found him. The extraction was not simple. The tree was in the middle of a flooded area that the helicopter could not land in. A rescue diver went into the water. The crocodiles, presented with a new variable, moved away from the immediate area as the mechanical noise and the human activity altered the environmental calculus they had been running for 9 days. He was lifted from the tree in a harness, and he has said that the sensation of leaving the tree, of no longer being responsible for maintaining the grip that had kept him alive, was something he did not know how to process for the first several minutes, that his hands kept trying to grip something that was not there. He was in the hospital for 11 days. The physical damage was significant and specific. Severe muscle degradation from 9 days of static exertion in the held position. Dehydration that required careful rehydration because rehydrating too quickly after that level of deficit causes its own complications. The cognitive effects of the sleep deprivation resolved over several weeks, though he reports that his relationship with sleep changed permanently. That the specific anxiety of feeling himself approach unconsciousness is something he has had to learn to manage in a way he never had to before. The crocodiles remained in the area until the flooding receded. This is documented. They were not unusual individuals. They were not particularly aggressive individuals. They were ordinary saltwater crocodiles doing what saltwater crocodiles do, which is to identify a potential food source and apply patience to the problem of accessing it. They had applied patience for 9 days, and then the food source had been removed, and they had moved on to other calculations. He went back to guiding, not immediately, not without difficulty, but eventually. He has spoken about what it took to be near the water again, to be in environments where crocodiles were present, to do the work that he had done before the flood, with the specific additional knowledge of what that work could become. He went back because guiding was what he was, and because not going back would have given the 9 days a power over his life that he was not willing to grant. He says the hardest thing was not the crocodiles. The hardest thing was the voices. The specific experience of his own mind constructing arguments for his death, speaking to him in a language that was indistinguishable from reason, telling him to do the thing that would end him, and having to hold the knowledge that the voice was his own against the experience of hearing it as something external and authoritative. He had to refuse his own mind. He had to do it without sleep and without support and without any external resource to help him make the distinction between what the hallucination said and what he knew. He made the distinction 9 days in a row. That is the human limit. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment. Tell me at what point you think your mind would have accepted the argument. Which night you think you would have stopped being able to tell the difference between the voice in the water and the voice in your own head. I read every single comment. I will be back with another story from the place where human beings find out what they are made of, when the thing they are fighting is not outside them, but inside. The tree is still there. The flood receded. The crocodiles moved on. The fabric strips are gone, dissolved into the water, or taken by the current, which does not preserve evidence of what happened the way the human mind preserves it. He remembers the bark. He remembers the eyes in the water. He remembers the voices. And he remembers the specific moment on the 9th morning when he made himself ask whether the helicopter was real, and made himself wait for the answer, and the answer was yes, and the answer was enough.